So we all know that Arcane is an amazing show with incredible animation, tons of details, parallels, an amazing soundtrack, and endearing characters, and yes, some big issues too, let's be honest. So I wanted to study how all of those details come together to serve the narrative and make the most complete analysis I can, so I guess this will be a series of several videos. This one is the first one, and it will be about how Arcane's world building works.
If you wanna come play, you gotta start with me. And the monsters in my head. I got blood on my hands, and you're my revenge. And you push me to the edge. Do you wanna come play?
Arcane is an ensemble series with multiple characters, different communities in conflict, and political stakes. This automatically makes us think of Game of Thrones, but in how it builds its world, Arcane has a totally different approach. First off, Game of Thrones, like many high fantasy worlds, is set in what we see as a medieval universe where all kinds of domination, both medieval and current, show up. These are usually patriarchal, racist, homophobic universes. Arcane presents a world where dominations related to gender, sexual orientation, skin color, or a person's origins don't exist. This is both a way to bring in characters we don't usually see in fantasy universes, or to free them from the story arcs they're typically stuck in. But on top of that, it lets the show focus deeply on exploring one form of domination, the class domination of Piltover over Zaun. Again, unlike Game of Thrones, which presents a complex number of clans, nations, and political relationships, Arcane seemingly presents a simplified universe with two big blocks: Piltover on one side and Zaun on the other. This division is spatially organized in two ways. First, horizontally, with a bridge that creates a border, and vertically, to make the domination of the upper city over the lower city literally visible. Paradoxically, the bridge isn't meant to be crossed, and it represents a border. It serves as a witness, allowing the series to regularly highlight the evolving relationship between Zaun and Piltover, from the initial conflict in the opening scene to the reconciliation through collective mourning at the very end. But otherwise, most interactions that take place on the bridge don't go well. In fact, the bridge functions as a border and can even be a trap, as we recall with the children fleeing Jace's apartment. It's not a point of passage, and most scenes taking place there involve conflict. The bridge remains uncrossed by most characters and is almost taboo. The children cross it during their escape, but as intruders. Heimerdinger crosses the river hidden in a boat, and even when he returns with Echo, we don't see them cross the bridge. We don't know how they arrive in Piltover, but they likely took another path since they end up in the laboratory pipes, reinforcing this notion of secrecy. Heimerdinger is no longer a counselor, but already feels the need to hide when returning, a feeling probably strengthened by being with Echo. Moreover, the fact that Heimerdinger seems to be having fun as if it was an exciting adventure, while it represents a real risk for Echo, further illustrates how Piltover residents fail to realize the impact of their actions on Zaun. Heimerdinger enjoys himself since he has never been in true danger, whereas Echo has always been unwelcome in the upper city.
Don't you essentially own this place?
Shh.
It's entertainment for Heimer, with no real risk, and it's survival for Echo.
I apologize for the intrusion. We were attempting to sneak in.
In fact, the other characters who truly cross the bridge, except at the end, and moreover cross it together, are Vi and Caitlyn. Symbolically, they are the only two who manage to communicate, partly because they both set aside their prejudices, but also Caitlyn gets a complete tour of Zaun, from the brothel to the fissure, including Echo's tree. Caitlyn is the only one who observes and realizes the wrongs committed by Piltover. Conversely, Jace and Victor argue on the bridge. They too could play a role in consolidating or improving the relationship between Zaun and Piltover, but Jace, having never crossed the bridge and being full of classism, establishes the blockade, forgetting that Victor comes from the Undercity.
I told you I knew someone.
Well, you didn't say they were from the Undercity?
What difference does that make?
They're dangerous.
I'm from the Undercity.
He doesn't consider Victor as a Zaunite, but as an exception, and therefore doesn't question the system of domination. On the contrary, he reinforces it. The blockades placed on the bridge by Piltover are important because joining Piltover, and symbolically achieving social ascension, is difficult for Undercity residents. The blockades also show that this ascension is actively made impossible by Piltover, which literally gatekeeps the upper city. It's not just a question of architecture or ignorance. Obviously, after marginalizing Zaun, the bridge's is reopened when Piltover needs people for war. But spoiler alert, we'll discuss this issue in the problem section. From a vertical perspective, the names are very clear. We have the Topsiders and the Undercity.
Top sides and bottom, oil and water, that's all there is.
Piltover is characterized by towers, notably the Hex Gate, that we often see almost surrounded by clouds, as if the city were a kind of paradise in the sky, while we never finish descending to Ridge Zone, which would symbolically be hell.
I don't know what's lower than hell. Is there anything lower than hell?
Well, actually, yes, there is, because there's Stillwater. So let's make a little detour. Stillwater, the prison where Vi is held, is the true hell. Horizontally even more marginalized than Zon because there is no bridge, and vertically even lower. It evokes both the hell of monotheistic religions and the underworld of Greek mythology. Caitlin must cross by boat, with the ferrymen like the heroes of antiquity crossing the Styx with Karen to reach the world of deads, then descend into the red-colored depth, reminiscent of Christian hell, where she finds Vi, who, according to the guard, is regularly beaten like a damned soul by demons.
Who the hell are you?
The symbolism is not insignificant. First, it means that during the time skip, Vi is symbolically dead. She is socially dead since all the people she knew believe her to be dead.
You look good for a dead girl. She's back.
From the dead.
Symbolically and socially, Caitlin brings her back to life, and we understand Vi's perspective since we too experience the time skip. We don't know exactly how much time has passed, and even if we know how some characters have evolved, we don't know exactly what path they took to get there. We like reference points, just like Vi at that moment.
Echo?
Secondly, in the Greek mythology, when a hero goes down to the underworld, it's a mytheme called katabasis, in which the hero, a special being, will try to come back with a loved one he saved, a special knowledge, a secret, a new power, etc. It's a step in his initiatic journey, just like it is for Caitlin, because she comes back with more doubt about Piltover's system and her future loved one, even though she doesn't know it yet. As the part of being special, well, Caitlin is kind of special because she investigates on her own and has great skill to do it. But it is mostly her privileged status and her connections to Jace that allows her to free Vi.
I've got orders from Councillor Tallis concerning inmate 516.
So it's again about social status. The katabasis myth theme is also found in the second season, but this time it's Jinx stepping forward in her redemption and healing arc. She's initially going to save a loved one, but also frees the Jinxers, starts to see herself as forgivable, and ultimately she brings back another loved one as Vander's consciousness wakes up by seeing her. To go back to the prison itself, the functioning of Stillwater, which seems to operate almost autonomously from the city, gives us clues about what kind of regime Piltover really is. The prison is simply not regulated. Trials don't seem to exist since neither Vi nor the mass arrested Jinxers during the second season go through any justice system.
Is that all you have to say for yourself? There won't be a trial.
Yet we saw a trial in Piltover, but it was Jace's. So once again, justice in itself seems to be a privilege, just like Jace's cell. It's not fun, obviously, but he has books, windows, a table, and food usually found in the Undercity, when every time a Zonite is locked up, it's in an empty dark cell underground.
Imprisonment. What a curious principle. We confine the physical body, yet the mind is still free. I do love a good conundrum.
Yeah, I'm sure Vi would be thrilled to hear that. Moreover, when it comes to Stillwater, it seems that sentences have no time limits. Vi is incarcerated as a child and only gets out as an adult because Caitlin needs her. Otherwise, she would probably still be there. In itself, Stillwater functions exactly like an oubliette, which is a French word to talk about really deep cells in medieval castles for prisoners who were there to be forgotten. Inconvenient people are thrown in without trial and forgotten for indefinite periods, regardless of their crime or age. In fact, Vi doesn't even have a record. And guess where you can find oubliettes? In a place called Warwick Castle, a medieval castle that has the reputation to be haunted specifically in the tower and in the underground.
This is the most terrifying part of Warwick Castle, the jail. Let me show you. The jail was rebuilt to house the prisoners taken at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. It was drained only by the gully in the floor and ventilated by just one small shaft. And of course it was hardly lit at all, so it would have been very dark in here. But the most creepy part of the jail, I think, is in here. In this pit was the harshest treatment. Prisoners were bundled into the small, damp and lightless pit below the ground in this claustrophobic and insanitary space known as an oubliette, which means to forget in French. The wretched prisoner was, as the name implies, forgotten.
Initially, if still water is hell, there is probably a devil, and I was looking for him. Is it the guard? He's evil, but not that powerful. Is it Caitlin or Ambessa? I think they're too complex for this. But if you refer to Stillwater not as a Christian hell, but as an afterlife, Warwick is the ghost avenging the Zonites, since, even if we know he can attack anyone, the corpses are only enforcers and not jinxers. Piltover therefore has no system of regulation, justice, rehabilitation, etc. Obviously, except for Jace, who's in jail for like 5 minutes, the only people we see incarcerated are Zonites. The only change made by Piltover is made by Kate during her dictatorial phase. She tells this to Singed.
There are cells buried deep within this prison so devoid of light and fresh air and all basic human considerations that up till now, I have forbidden their use.
And indeed, the Jinxers are incarcerated at level -15, while Vi was at level -40. But we can consider that this change is sort of hypocritical, because not only Kate still uses those cells as a threat, so her new law seems to be flexible, but she's also stuffing Stillwater anyway. In the first season, it's not that Piltover truly forgot about Stillwater, it's that they don't care.
You ever been to Stillwater?
No.
So you just wave an arm, have someone dragged off, don't bother to find out what it does to someone being stuffed in a stone box for weeks or months or even years?
In the second season, when they need it, even after seeing how bad it was, they use it as a weapon. In short, symbolically, Stillwater is almost an afterlife. If Zon is marginalized, Stillwater is outside the world of the living, and also a power tool for Piltover. Besides, just like all of the places of power in Piltover, Stillwater is a tall and imposing building, but even if it's very tall, the prisoners are still kept underground. To return to Piltover and Zon, the domination of one over the other is marked by verticality, as Piltover is almost in the sky while Zon is underground. This is emphasized by the way the characters have to go lower and lower and lower, and by the camera moves. Zon is often filmed with high-angle shots, like it's squished down a hole, when Piltover is often filmed in large and low-angle shots, making it look spacious and tall, or even imposing and powerful. This use of height to illustrate power dynamics and social classes is also found within Piltover itself. The seats of power are the highest points, whether it's the council chamber, Mel's office, or the Hexgate Tower that allows Piltover to develop its commerce. Conversely, Jace's mother's house is lower and in the shadow of the towers. Jace's social ascension is illustrated by his evolution from one height to another. In contrast, under Vander's guardianship, the Undercity seems to function more horizontally, as the center of power is regularly shown to be at the center of the city rather than elevated, as it's Vander's bar, the last drop. At this point, the Undercity's functioning differs from Piltover's, since the seat of power is also a gathering and convivial space where everyone can belong, and where Vander, as both leader and bartender, is both mingling with the crowd, protecting and literally serving them. During this time, Silco works on the margins and symbolically even lower, underwater at the cannery. This detail participates to put the cannery as one of the lower points in Zon, so obviously it's a way to antagonize Silco because he's working in the shadow to overthrow Vanders, but it's also one of the most traumatic places for Jinx. So when she targets Piltover's council, she literally fires from one of the Undercity's lowest and helpless places towards the highest seat of power. When Silco takes power, the Undercity's dynamic changes, and despite wanting to break from Piltover's influence, he recreates a similar power structure, since the Shimmer addicts and the most marginalized people end up in the crack, so even lower.
What is this place? It's where the kind of people you topsiders don't want to think about wind up. It was never this big, though.
In the crack, we can also see Vi and Jinx's old house, so we can imagine that the First War allowed Zon to abandon certain levels, like this one, as well as the mines in order to rise a little. Silco, however, a supporter of Zon's independence, makes people fall back into it, and thus makes them lose social gain, so to say, by recreating Piltover dynamics. And in the same way that Silco stratifies the lower city by reopening lower floors, Silco takes control of the last drop, But unlike Vendor, who stands behind the bar, Silco maintains this verticality by placing his office above the bar, and we never see him mingling with the crowd. I know this divides the fandom. Is Silco placing himself above Zonites, or is he melting with them by governing through the last drop? I'd say it's both. He's confident enough in his authority to stay in the middle of the town, so he must be accepted by some of the inhabitants. But he's also not mixing with them, as he's on the top floor, suggesting a strong hierarchy. Taking over the place of his predecessor is also a sign of dominance. In fact, the only person he allows to be higher than him is Jinx, which shows how differently their relationship work and how privileged she is. The true difference between Vendors and Silco is that Silco cares about a cause and Vendors cares about the people. They function as two opposites, since Silco will use of any means for what he thinks is right, but recreates the same oppression as their first oppressor by stratifying Zon and making children work, even if the reason of his rebellion is in part bad work condition in the mine.
Have you forgotten where we came from? The mines they had us in?
Vendors, on the other side, protects people but doesn't offer any change. That said, don't worry, I love Silco and will defend him and think about why he uses those means later. The real thing that shows how Silco is making Zon look like Piltover is his way of governing, as we saw in his office, but also from the Cambaron's tower, which is elevated and built as a mirror of Piltover's. Besides, Silco is also the only Undercity's character to wear clothes mimicking Piltover's, particularly the councillors.
But I pulled you all up from the depths. Offered you a taste of topside.
Conversely, Piltover's council retreats to the bunker and falls to the basement after Jinx's attack, thus losing power, which allows Caitlyn to reclaim it. First unofficially in the bunker, then when her dictatorship becomes official, once again at height and in broad daylight. So before talking more about Zon's geography, let's focus on the two opposite and mirroring councils and a specific detail, their tables. The two council's members, even if they don't have much in common, are meant to mirror each other. Smeech is a Yordle, like Heimerdinger. Mel has the same initials as Madame Margot. Cross is in a wheelchair, just like Salo will be later. Brenny's anger is used by Ambessa, just like Kate's. And Finn can be compared to Jace, since he tries to overthrow Silco, just like Jace overthrows Heimerdinger. The difference is that Finn dies while Jace succeeds, and there's a very specific reason for this. The Piltover Council hides behind a valorizing narrative that only Heimerdinger truly believes in, whereas Silco is perfectly aware of the fragility of his position and maintains it through force, and this is directly visible at their table. The Piltover Council table is round, so to speak. In Arthurian legend, the table where the knights and King Arthur sit is round to maintain equality among the members, even though one of them is king.
J'ai fait construire une grande table pour que les chevaliers s'assoient ensemble. Je l'ai voulu ronde, pour qu'aucun d'entre eux ne se retrouve assis dans un angle ou en bout de table.
However, Piltover's table has a gap to let the person being addressed by the council enter the circle, and is the case with Jace. This creates an extremely oppressive atmosphere for the person in question, as if they were caught in a vice, but it also establishes a hierarchical relationship among the members, since there is one person who will face the interlocutors, and thus be at the head of the table, or at the center. By the way, in that shot precisely, Jace is kicking Heimerdinger out of the council, so the table is inclined to make him at the center and not Heimer. The hierarchical arrangement in space initially puts Heimerdinger at the center, and since he is the oldest one and uses his age as an argument of authority, he's supposed to be the leader and the most influential one. But as we all know, this isn't the case, since in reality the most influential person of the council is Mel. In contrast, this hierarchy is completely acknowledged on Zon's side, since the table is rectangular, with Silco enthroned at the end, and since the Cambarons function like a mafia. Each one of them controls a part of Zon, has their own gang, their own territory with their own seat, they openly defend their own interests, and depend on Silco, who they try to overthrow twice. Piltover presents a much more polished narrative with its round table and the supposed objective of working for the betterment of the city. But the end result is the same. Each person works for their own interests, and the only one who isn't aware of this is Heimerdinger. First, because he isn't always present. He's there to talk about Hextech, science, blah blah blah, but isn't there when Grayson discusses the true political questions concerning Zahn. In this scene, it's Mel who is positioned at the top of the steps. Yes, with that guy too. But first, she towers over him, her posture is different, she stands out from the rest of the council in her white dress, she's in the center of the stained glass window, and besides, we know very well what she thinks of the counselor next to her, as she offered him a toy saying,
For your birthday, counselor.
Oh, Mel, this is too kind.
I'm told it was built only for the sharpest of minds.
And then he doesn't even get through it. The verticality of the Zahn Council is maintained through brutality and is acknowledged, while Piltover's exists in the shadows and is maintained through manipulation, and the political and above all economical stakes are actually played out in another location. Historically, the theater was for a long time a place where the aristocracy went to be seen rather than to actually see a play, as a form of social distinction. In an Italian-style theater, just like in Arcane, the hall is divided into several parts. First, obviously the stage and the wings, the orchestra, where the affluent classes could sit, the boxes, occupied by the wealthiest and most privileged, because they offered more comfort and space, but especially the possibility of being seen, and above the gallery, also called Paradise because it was very close to the ceiling, which was reserved for the poorest classes because visibility was mediocre and there was no comfort at all. It's actually so uncomfortable that in French we call this part the chicken coop. In Arcane, there is obviously no gallery since the poorest classes cannot afford to set foot in a theater. However, there are indeed boxes, and that's where the counselors do business and where Mel manipulates, or at least pushes Jace to find investors for Hextech. Since the counselors from then on have economical interests in this project, obviously their decisions are biased. Mel is in the highest box and watches Jace make deals just like she wanted. Being the highest, she is indeed the most powerful one, while Hammerdinger is, well, at the bottom in the orchestra, and the only one actually having fun watching the show. So the theater is the actual place where political stakes, which are in fact economical, are played out, and it belongs to Mel, given that we can see the Medarda family seal on the facade. Moreover, in the same way that the council falls from the top of the tower to the bunker in Season 2, with the political situation being much more complex, Mel no longer operates in the boxes, but is hidden with Lest in the wings, illustrating once again her loss of influence and the weakening of the councilor's power. Now let's go back to Zahn's geography. There are other key locations situated even further on the margins and seemingly escaping the different political systems, each in their way. Sinch's cave suggests a hidden and rejected presence, even more underground and marginal than the Undercity, kind of like Silco's cannery. In both locations, we find the presence of water, which often symbolically represents a passage to another world in mythology and fantasy. The river separates Zahn and Piltover, and as we saw, participates in making still water a symbol of afterlife. In Arthurian literature, there is a recurring motif where a knight chases a white animal that is escaping him. The knight follows it until he crosses a river and finds a magical place, a world of fairy beings where human laws, both physical and political, don't apply. In those stories, the river is a liquid border between the human world and the fairy world. Victor kinda takes this path, even if the magical elements are transformed into scientific ones. Instead of an animal, it's his boat that he follows, but you can see a white butterfly on the side of the river, and then he crosses the water to join Singed. Just like the animal is replaced by a boat, a mechanical and technological object, the fairy world is replaced by a scientific place, the dragon is an experimental mutation, and the wizard is a kind of mad scientist. Symbolically, Victor discovers another small world, a place outside the laws established by Piltover and Zahn, laws that are political but also moral and ethical, particularly regarding scientific boundaries. Singed is indeed living outside societal laws, but he's using science to push the physical limits of natural laws by attempting to conquer death. Paradoxically, he does it without respect for the living, as he experiments on animals, on Rio, but also on humans like Vander or Deckard, whose head ends up right here. The cave is therefore politically situated outside of the conflict between Zahn and Piltover, and Singed offers his services as long as it benefits him regardless of the side, since he worked for Silco and then for Mbessa. The only moment when Singed seems to choose a side regarding the social conflict is when he joins Sevika's gathering, but this position is quickly nullified when he releases the beast without concern for who it might hurt. So, Sinch's spatial situation is more related to the scientific conflict than the political one, and stands opposite to the ethical considerations and prudence that push Heimerdinger towards passivity.
You've actually done it. But just because it can be done doesn't mean...
On the contrary, Singed will seize an opportunity if presented. Victor is the only one who can find the cave because he's marginalized by his disability, but he leaves after witnessing Singe's harmful nature and comes back to him later. This directly refers to Plato's cave. The cave myth, or allegory of the cave, is a story that Plato tells in the Republic. Prisoners are chained in a cave and only see shadows that they mistake for the real world. A prisoner eventually escapes and leaves the cave, discovering the real world and notably the sun, which represents knowledge. He then goes back down into the cave to fetch the others and share his knowledge with them. Plato supposes that he would then be very poorly received, that he wouldn't be believed, or even that he might eventually be killed. The cave is a place of ignorance, artificiality, and without light, and the outside is a world illuminated by reason. Singe's cave is not a place of ignorance, it is a place of knowledge where wisdom is missing. Singe remains in this perspective until the end of the series, since even though he presumably left the cave through Silco, nothing evolves with his methods. On the contrary, Victor has the broadest social ascension. From the cave that he abandons, he finds himself in Piltover, a place where progress and science are acclaimed but regulated. However, it is not the world that creates illumination for him. Although his social ascension is visible, once again through heights, the fact that he regularly takes refuge where water flows still puts him on the margins of Piltover, as if truly being part of it was impossible. Victor's true illumination is in his fusion with the Hex Core. Victor's entire journey can moreover be read as an anti-myth of the cave and an objection to Plato's ideas, since having literally had access to the world of ideas, immaterial and detached from the body and passions, Victor returns to another cave until finally losing sight of what makes one human and wanting to annihilate emotions to achieve what he considers to be the great evolution. He is then indeed received by the other characters as an antagonist, but as opposed to the character from Plato's cave, this is justified. Arcane takes up the cave myth and extends it to counter Plato's idea that humans must detach themselves from their passions, objecting that it is precisely these passions that make them human. The series also highlights the fact that too great of a disparity in knowledge creates a dangerous asymmetry. Victor's disciples don't reject him as Plato supposes, but commit themselves without knowing what they're truly signing up for. Victor loses some of his empathy for them and begins to sort out those who are worth it or not.
He is worth the risk.
He agrees to save Vendor, but uses other people's bodies as if they were phones, and sometimes putting them in danger as he does with Salo. The series make an objection to the cave allegory by also saying that the man in question can return from the outside with a sense of superiority that would make him potentially dangerous. To get back to Singed, he ends up there after being banished from Piltover for his experiments, thus socially descending a major level and finding himself in Zaun, which confirms how catastrophic Piltover's judicial system is. First, because it depends on a person's social origin, since the punishment basically amounts to going down one floor regardless of the crime. Singe therefore ends up in Zaun, while a Zaunite for the same offense would end up in Stillwater. This also shows us that social status remains extremely fragile. While it's very difficult to climb up, it's rather easy to fall down. Secondly, it shows us that topsiders send everything that doesn't suit them down to Zaun, whether it's pollution or people. Singe is considered dangerous by the topsiders, but it doesn't bother them to send him to the Undercity. Zaun is also a kind of dump where they send humans they consider burdensome, not only without caring about the safety of Zaunites, but also without consideration for each other, even amongst the topsiders themselves. Obviously, banishing Singed only deepened his flaws. This punitive approach by Piltover implies that transformative or rehabilitative justice doesn't exist. Singe probably needed help to grieve his daughter more than being thrown into solitude and poverty. The Firelight Tree is also marginal, but, in contrast with the cave, very politically oriented, particularly within Zaun as opponents of Silco. Even though Echo is the leader, the notion of authority appears differently, even though the place is also organized around the vertical axis, the tree. This time, verticality is not about hierarchizing the inhabitants, it's about putting nature back in the center and living as equals as everyone lives in the tree. This place is also hidden, like the cave, since people brought there are blindfolded, but this time it's not due to rejection like it is for Singed, it's for protection. The Firelights are voluntarily isolated to escape both Silco's and Piltover's oppression. It's a militant place of resistance. The fact that the place is secret might suggest that it creates a hierarchy between those who have the right to enter and those who don't, but as Echo says,
we're not turning people away.
So Echo's leadership looks more like Vander's, which is also suggested by the Vander statue. This statue remains a rallying point of Zaun when Sevika is trying to unite the clans, suggesting Vanders could unite people when Silco couldn't. But when Silco's drinking alone by the fountain, we can see Echo's name engraved on the statue as if Echo were symbolically Vander's successor, since there is continuity in their way of governing, and not in Silco's. But just like both Vander's and Silco's way of ruling have flaws, Echo's way does too. He's not oppressive like Silco, and he's not passive like Vander's, and doesn't make compromise with Silco like Vander's did with Piltover, but that's the problem. He's only fighting Silco, almost forgetting Piltover. This can be explained by the fact that Silco's oppression is perceptible, brutal, and violent, and transformed the territory in a very visible way, while Piltover's is invisible and insidious, and exists through indifference, pollution, and abandonment. Despite physically isolating themselves, since to reach them you have to go through a pipe, and having organized the community around their own axis and visibly managing to partially escape Silco's reign, the Firelights do not, however, escape the oppression of Piltover, which continues to loom over them as the waste rejected by the Hex Core is dumped on them and begins to destroy the tree. It's kind of the only mistake Echo makes, focusing on Silco as if he was their only oppressor, and forgetting about Piltover. This leads the community to a dead end. They don't have the space to take everyone in, and the tree itself is dying. Finally, Jinx's room is also a place of marginality. Although she's extremely involved in the class conflicts, since Jinx is first alongside Silco and then becomes a symbol of freedom for Zaun, her room also seems to exist on the fringe. First, because the location appears quite secretive, as the only people who find it are Sevika, Silco, and Isha. In other words, people close to Jinx and people she trusts. This idea is reinforced by the fact that neither Smeech, Caitlyn, nor Vi manage to find it when she's being sought. The implication being that people who can find the room are those who Jinx has invited to enter. Echo is an exception since Jinx didn't show him but Powder did in the alternative reality. Incidentally, Echo also showed his secret place to Powder, but we'll come back to the relationship between Jinx and Echo later. Regarding the room, it also functions on a vertical axis and reflects Jinx's free electron nature, since even Silco doesn't really have control over what she does or doesn't do, and her way of taking part in the conflict is chaotic depending on the moment. The wobbly aspect of the helix and the fact that it overlooks the void reflects Jinx's on-the-edge nature and her shaky, fragile mental health. Jinx's room shows how, despite being completely linked to Zaun, she isn't fully invested in a cause, since she stays there alone most of the time until finally the room flies off to fight Victor. The most interesting thing about that space is that it's actually a projection of Jinx's psyche and varies according to her mental state. But we'll come back to that when we discuss Jinx in more detail. Obviously, it's not just the heights and the separation created by the bridge that visually divides Zaun and Piltover. It's also very different and distinct aesthetics on both sides, whether it be colors, light, architecture, street art, animals, relationship to nature, etc. First, Piltover is designed to be a patchwork of different cities associated with modernity, wealth, power, and progress. The glass building may be a reference to the Crystal Palace in London or the Grand Palais in Paris. The globe is a reference to the celestial globe built next to the Eiffel Tower in Paris during the Universal Exhibition, even celebrating technological innovation. This building can remind us of the Carbide and Carbon Building in Chicago, or the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building in New York, and in general, the city's heights evoke Manhattan, Wall Street, and its financial power. This one also suggests the United States, as it recalls Art Deco buildings, sometimes called sunburst buildings, which are structures designed to give the impression of radiating light, notably through their color or their stepped shape, which was intended to reduce the shadows cast by the building. The clock tower is a reference to Big Ben in London. The two foreground buildings, or the Academy, are reminiscent of the City Hall in Paris. Generally, Piltover evokes Paris's Haussmannian architecture, particularly through the light-colored facades, zinc roofs, and mansard roofs. Finally, this particular building brings to mind the Bullock's Wilshire in Los Angeles. Furthermore, aside from the glass building, these structures are new. They only appear after the time skip, demonstrating the extent to which Hextech has accelerated the city's growth. And the visible scaffolding shows that this growth is still underway. Piltover's architecture is inspired by Art Deco, while Zon's come from Art Nouveau and Gothic styles. Historically, Art Nouveau was a multifaceted and international artistic movement that emerged in 1860. It drew inspiration from nature by favoring curves, arabesques, and asymmetry for almost organic, colorful, and dreamlike renderings. Even though some objects like jewelry or furniture were very expensive, the artist's goal was to ideally make this art accessible to all by using materials that were not noble, such as iron and steel. Generally not elitist, this artistic movement wants to be a part of daily life.
One of the key elements within Modernista architecture, which is what all these architects were labelled, including Gaudi, is their commitment to public space, to transforming their city for everybody. And it is one of the major features of Barcelona that architecture is a public art.
So it tends to erase the boundaries between arts considered major or fine, like oil painting or sculpture, and arts considered as minor, applied, or craftsmanship. So those artists didn't work only on traditional media, but on everyday life objects like lamps, perfume bottles, or jewelry.
Gaudi believed that all things useful should also be aesthetically pleasing. Some of the chimneys are used to evacuate smoke, while others are for ventilation.
The most famous example might be Murat's theater posters or his advertising drawings for job rolling paper, which Arcane references quite clearly several times. Art Deco is a movement that was born around 1910 and peaked after World War I, and it is characterized by a very minimalist aesthetic and straight lines, to showcase refinement and luxury by using materials such as gold, ebony, or ivory. This aesthetic is found notably in luxury cruise ships addressed to the wealthiest classes, or in buildings through vertical lines. It is obviously this second current that we find in Piltover. Through straight lines, the building's minimalism, precious materials that you see in all of these golden lines, and symmetry. Everything is either symmetrical or well organized. This aesthetic organization, even in trimmed vegetation, underlines the stratified, controlled, predictable, and ordered aspect of Piltover. Nothing stands out. On the contrary, Zon, with its much more chaotic aesthetic, has something more organic and unpredictable, as if the city adapted and survived even under constraint. The curved lines, as opposed to the vertical lines, give the idea of a much more horizontal community. On one hand, it emphasizes the resilience of the inhabitants, but on the other hand, it also shows their ability to adapt and their intelligence in how they recover, repair, and recycle materials. The old murals and then the street art also highlight their creativity, freedom, and ability to rebel. The downside is that despite everything, Zon looks very, very cool to the audience, and one could criticize this aesthetic for romanticizing poverty. Art Nouveau is also found in Piltover, since these are two fairly close movements, and Art Deco drew from Art Nouveau, which also gives the impression that Piltover is more recent and needed Zon to be born, while the opposite is not true. That said, the presence of Art Nouveau in Piltover is no coincidence. For example, we find a Murat-styled poster in Jace's room who comes from a lower social class than, for example, Caitlin. Her house really falls under Art Deco, which further underlines the fact that Jace is not originally part of the elite. It goes the same for Sky's notebook. It's a mix. The curve, the leaf motif, and the color look like Art Nouveau, reminding her Zonite origins, but the symmetry and the gold detail looks more like Art Deco, aka Piltover style. Under Silco, Zon takes on a more cyberpunk aesthetic marked by the omnipresence of neon. The purple neon lights obviously call back to the shimmer, and the green neon lights call back to Silco since this green color is associated with him. Both colors also remind us of Singe's lab and give the impression that the corruption from his lab has spread throughout the city, which paradoxically seems to have grown richer. By getting rich from shimmer trafficking, Silco has allowed some to prosper financially, while others have been precipitated into the cracks, as we've already seen. The curves that shimmer leaves on walls or on the veins of its victims echo the curves of the city and make it seem like it has been completely corrupted. What was organic has become parasitic. The scene where Sevika walks to the last drop is there to echo the welcome to the playground scene where children take the same route. Inequalities are greater and the city is more violent. The Last Drop is no longer a communal space where people meet, it's a place of excess. I'm not saying you can't party there, I even think it would have done the Zonites good to have a place like this in addition to the pub under Vendor, but arm wrestling over a wolf trap, not so sure. Besides, in Vendor's introduction scene, we see him defend Huck against two airship pirates who try to scam him, but he manages to make peace with them and doesn't kick them out. Conversely, Silco has security guards watching over the Last Drop's door. Besides the colors and neon lights, there is also the eye symbol that appears under Silco and that we see several times. First, it directly references Silco himself since he has only one valid eye, but it's also a symbol used extremely frequently in art to represent the surveillance of totalitarian and oppressive regimes over a population, whether it's the Eye of Sauron or Big Brother's eye in 1984. Besides, Silco's eye has the same color as Sauron's. Even if he injects shimmer in it, it doesn't turn purple. The eye reminds us of these other references and helps symbolically establish Silco's domination over Zon. Sauron and Big Brother are the two obvious references when it comes to an eye symbol, but to be honest, the first reference that came to my mind when I saw it was Count Olaf from A Series of Unfortunate Events. This character has an eye tattooed on his ankle, and generally eyes like all over his house, and honestly, there might be a parallel to draw there. Count Olaf is also an antagonist who adopts children, including Violet, an inventor and mechanical genius, to use them to achieve his goals. Oh yeah, and there's also this.
The story will be dreadful, melancholy, and calamitous. A word which here means dreadful and melancholy.
Obviously, the difference is that Silco sincerely loves Jinx, while Count Olaf is abusive in every way, but it could be a way to remind us of him, to better subvert the trope of the bad substitute parent, because ultimately, even if Silco uses Jinx, he never aims to hurt her. But anyway, we'll talk about that in the character part, because there is much more to say about Silco, and the eye is also used to draw a parallel with Kate. Even though the authoritarian system established by Silco is powerful, the fact that Vi brings down one of his eye statues is a way of showing how she undermines Silco. Although she is just one individual and moreover completely lost since she has been away for 7 years, her return is the grain of sand in the gears that can throw Silco's entire system into chaos. Regarding the physiognomy of the two districts, we can also note a difference in urban arts. Obviously, you can find any street art in the upper city, however, on both sides you can find statues, paintings, or engravings. In Piltover, there are abstract artworks or statues representing residents who have marked the city's history, while in Zon, apart from Vendor's statue, most statues and engraving represent deities. Even if we don't dwell on them, except for Janna, given the fact that Jinx tells her story.
Miners trapped underground, air running thin, but then some wispy wind woman wafts to their rescue.
This implies that there might be a certain spirituality and potentially different cults, different legends that circulate in the lower city, which is not the case for Piltover. The first is that Zon is older than Piltover, which is confirmed by League of Legends lore, but also makes sense through their architecture since Art Deco comes after Art Nouveau. The second thing is that Piltover focuses on its own history and future. As the city of progress, they keep in memory those who contributed to its scientific and economic hegemony, whereas Zon needs hope and unifying myths that it seeks in common stories and legends from the past. This shows the perception that the two cities have of their own capacity to act. Piltover believes it has a great control over its destiny and future through technology, science, wealth, and established rules, while Zon, which has little control, needs beliefs and common unifying stories to stay alive and keep hope. The only person who has a statue of them in Zon is Vendor. His statue is once again made of sheet metal and recycled materials, and therefore contrasts with Piltover's Counselor's gold statue. Silco doesn't have a statue, but on this one, which is apparently a League of Legends deity, we can see that Silco's symbol has been added to it and that people are offering what seems to be eyes. So we can imagine that Silco is seen as a savior by some people, while Vendor is a unifying figure. In both cases, they're not figures that encourage people to act. The first one because he's supposed to act for others, the second one because he united them but didn't act. So Piltover overestimates its capacity for action and control, while Zon underestimates it. Well, until... Ironically, she becomes the new Janna because she frees Zon from the Grey while she was mocking the legend herself and destroying Janna's engraving. She refuses passivity, but also refuses to be a leader figure, so she was just the trigger people needed to act on their own. Zaan's atmosphere remains permeated with grey, which is felt through the colors, especially those surrounding Silco, connecting him to the gas and the toxic atmosphere. Paradoxically, it was the oppression of miners, which were victims of the gas, that gave Silco his revolutionary convictions. This is another marker of how Silco's way of governing recreates what he's fighting against in the first place, and that opposes him to Vendors, who is associated with a warm but ambivalent red color. We'll come back to this later. Besides, when Sevika's turning against Vendors, she's in a green light, whereas other people who stand with him stay in the red light. The grey is later released by Kate over the city, and no, I'm sorry, but she's not only targeting the Cambarans. I mean, it's gas, it can't be controlled like that. If Jinx's explosion causes friendly fire to the point of killing her entire family, I don't see how the gas would only reach the evil Cambarans without affecting the people around them. Yes, she's targeting their seat, but she also releases a part of it on the street.
Poisoning our air.
Only targeting the Cambarans with gas is what Silco did, in a closed space with a little carboy. Anyway, before Kate uses the grey, her own mother had decreed in the past that
the people of the underground deserve to breathe.
She is presented as someone taking a big step toward social progress, as if she was some kind of very progressive woman, which is insane since granting air isn't even the minimum of human decency. That shows how low the bar is. Therefore, the grey has left traces, which are felt in the colors, but also in the fact that enforcers wear masks when they go down. Piltover and Zaan literally do not breathe the same air. We can also see among the people consuming shimmer, people breathing from pure air bottles. So in Zaan there is an air business, and the very air that Piltover breathes is a privilege in itself.
Offered you a taste of topside and fresh air.
Again, this gap is marked by the fact that Heimerdinger is oblivious to it and comments on the settings of Echo's hoverboard.
Though these blades seem improperly pitched.
You're wrong. It's designed for the fissures. Air is denser.
Which shows the carelessness or even passive oppression of Piltover. But the saddest thing is probably the fact that Vi, once out of prison, doesn't seem comfortable in front of the cable car. It's once she's back in Zaan that she takes a deep breath of air. It's by finding this thick and polluted air that she feels free and home again. So each community has a completely different relationship to the air, and as a result to nature as well. Plants are extremely rare in Zaan, since most of them cannot grow with this little light and oxygen. On one hand, there are climbing plants sometimes, which are often considered as invasive and are known to grow even in bad conditions. This highlights again how the city is not offering livable conditions and how life adapts anyway. On the other hand, since they produce oxygen, plants are extremely precious. This is also why the firelights are organized around the tree, in a respectful logic where nature is shared with all inhabitants and improve their life quality. In contrast, in Silco's system, the only spot where you can find a plant is in the Cambarans' council chamber, as if it were a privilege that Silco's council keeps for itself rather than sharing, until Silco just kills the plant, which again shows how he contributes to Zaan's destruction and has little regard for what could really save it, and by the way, he almost made air a privilege. Piltover also doesn't prioritize nature, and we actually see very little vegetation there, or only in very particular and separate places, like the park where the shooting contest between Grayson and Caitlin takes place, the cemetery, or the tree where Kate goes to mourn her mother. It's a different approach from the other two found in Zaan, but it's one that reflects Piltover's mentality very well. Natural spaces are isolated and have a function. They serve as settings by becoming places for the dead, or simply places for activities. Basically, it's not the human species that adapts to nature as Echo does, it's nature that is adapted to humans. However, just like in the Cambarans' Council, nature can serve as a social distinction since the place where Kate mourns her mother seems little frequented or even private.
Mother and I used to come here when we needed an escape.
The difference is that with Silco, the social distinction given by the plant reflects the vital aspect of nature for Zaan, whereas in Piltover, it's just a decorative luxury. The precious aspect of nature is perceived only as an aesthetic element, a decorative value, not as an essential element to human or community survival. In itself, nature offers purely practical spaces for certain activities and has an ornamental function. Just like many things in Piltover, aesthetics prevails, and the limited presence of natural spaces into the city shows how much Topsiders prioritize technology, but especially how Piltover maintains a superficial and above all extractive relationship with flora. It's exploited, just like Zaan's labor force and therefore the inhabitants' bodies, which are controlled and treated like a resource. This can also be seen in both relationship to the sea, the sky, or animals. In Piltover, the sea and therefore water is a border. The port and docks, like the bridge, are a space of political tension, since that's where Ambessa arrives, but also where Jace meets Silco to negotiate the ceasefire. Besides, Jace tells it himself to Silco.
I was reminded recently of what brought us together in the first place. The threats beyond our walls.
This hostility can also be seen in the fact that there are cannons on the docks, whereas Silco maintains a spiritual relationship with the sea, considering it a place of rebirth. Moreover, when Topsiders are confronted to nature, they are rather confronted to a hostile one. It is the case for Jace as a child, who nearly dies in the snow, or with Mel when the Black Rose witches make her see the noxious throne room invaded by vegetation, whereas for the children of Zaan, the waterway is one of the few playgrounds. Speaking of the Black Rose, nature is also linked with magic. The only time we see Mel outside of an urban environment is when she discovers her power, and the world is described as
a perilous place for a solitary mage.
While for Zaanites, it's the opposite. Besides, Piltover wants to control magic just like nature. Same goes for the sky, which in Zaan becomes a space for commercial exchange, while Powder, amazed by the airships, dreams of travel. Moreover, as I said, Piltover's control over nature can also be seen in its relationship with animals. We won't completely delve into the question of animals right now, because they are mainly there to be connected to particular characters. Butterflies often appear with Victor and Jace, ravens with Jinx, firelights with Echo, and we'll talk about it in the second part. That said, the animals still help emphasize the Zaan versus Piltover and the Echo versus Silco dualities, and to understand their relationship with living things in general. The first time we see Silco, since we're used to somewhat cliché villains, we quickly associate him with the Sphinx cats, since these cats are quite disliked because they're considered ugly.
Oh, what the hell is that?
It's a cat.
That is not a cat.
We easily make the parallel with Silco, who also has unusual skin because of his scar. But Silco is actually associated with deep-sea creatures. The cat is just a guinea pig that gets eaten by the shimmer-boosted rat. Just like the plant, this already shows us that Silco has no particular respect for living things and has relative empathy. Obviously, Sinch doesn't care at all. But it depicts how Silco wants to reverse the power dynamic and turn the prey into the predator by using shimmer. Conversely, we find a Sphinx cat sleeping peacefully near children by Echo's tree, in addition to the firelights, which again shows how everyone is welcome and how Echo and his community put living things at the center. The tree is not just there for humans to benefit from, as animals also have their place in its ecosystem.
We call them firelights. Never seen so many though.
Piltover, as usual, doesn't display Sinch or Silco's violence, but we see very few animals there. In fact, we see more in Zaan. The only animals we see are doves, very often flying very high up. They give the impression of a peaceful city, while the ravens we see several times with Jinx are associated with death and emphasize the hostile aspect of Zaan. That said, Piltover's peace is very superficial. The doves can therefore also represent the Councilor's denial and the fact that Piltover's heights are generally indifferent to what happens below, since they are almost never affected. We saw this in the introduction scene. The bridge is on fire, Vi and Powder just became orphans, but when Vi looks at Piltover, it remains unreached by the fire and the smoke. And regarding animals in Piltover, well, except for Heimer's Poro, mais on pouvait dire Heimer tout ce temps, et je me suis fait chier à dire Heimerdinger, mais disons Heimer tout le temps alors. And regarding animals in Piltover, well, except for Heimer's Poro, that's about it. The other animals we see are mechanical, suggesting that animals are also treated as an aesthetic element of the city. The painting we see at the Kiramans' home depicting the family after a hunting party suggests that animal life, like nature in general, is put at the service of human leisure, whether it's the hunting dogs trained to have a specific purpose, like tools, or the dead raptor, which is kind of a bird from League of Legends, and still, they're on the family portrait, so again, decorating elements. We ultimately see many more animals in the lower city, animals generally considered as pests that help associate the lower city with dirt, death, darkness, and misery, like ravens, bats, insects, and many rats, very often combined with children scavenging through garbage. Those animals, especially rats and cockroaches, even if we generally have a negative image of them, also represent the ability to survive in a hostile environment and to adapt to difficult conditions, which is the case for the inhabitants of Zon, who have a culture, if we can say so, of resourcefulness. Reflecting Zon's wilder side when Silco's in control, there is also wild animals as pets, like a crocodile, and a kind of evil-looking double of Heimerdinger's Poro. We also see a caged krog several times, which is a nod to League of Legends, but which can also be a reference to this adaptability of Zon's inhabitants, partly because it's a mob that multiplies when killed, but also because it's one of the mobs that is the most hunted by players to farm XP, which can again be a metaphor or reference to the adaptability, ingenuity, and resourcefulness of Zonites. Moreover, the character's vocabulary when it comes to animals regularly shows classist logic, partly because the topsiders speak of Zonites like this.
What can I get you?
4 sump rats will do.
And as tensions rise, they increasingly dehumanize them.
But we can't make a deal with a snake and cut off its head.
What kind of animals?
To think we nearly extended sovereignty to the creatures who did this. There will be no more fairy tales of peace until we scour our basement of its demons.
But also because the internalized classism is not the same. Mbessa has no trouble considering herself a wolf and belittles Mel, who, according to her, would be a fox.
Still a fox.
Yet, a fox is still a predator, a carnivore, and it has a reputation of being clever. But for Mbessa, it's already insufficient enough to be an insult. Even when Les says that Mbessa is vulnerable, she compares her to a cat.
Dangerous as she is, your mother was spooked. Could smell it. Like a cat backed into a corner.
Alright, it's much more vulnerable than a wolf, but it's still a predator, especially for rats. In contrast, the Zonites among themselves call each other animals that have much worse reputations.
I got more in common with cave lice than Jinx.
Lapdog monsters.
Parasites. Not for a worm like him.
I grew up knowing I'm less than them. That my place is down there.
Obviously, between the great city of progress and the city that serves as its dumping ground, the technological difference is crazy. This duality is clearly expressed through the opposition between Shimmer and Hextech, but we can also see it very distinctly in other elements, notably in props. In animation, the term props is used to talk about everything that is neither a place nor a character, but that must be animated, particularly because characters interact with it. This, for example, includes furniture, vehicles, objects, or food. Props are extremely different depending on whether they're in Piltover or Zon. In the Undercity, everything appears to be secondhand. Very few objects are smooth. They're often dented, cracked, stained, worn, and made from different materials that have been patched together. For example, objects that are supposed to be round or straight are often scarred, and nothing is perfectly round, not even the coins, which are irregular with a hole in the middle, making them look worth less than Silco's, since him and his council have coins that are intact, showing that they hold more power and wealth. Paradoxically, in Piltover, we don't see any money, which leads us to imagine that much larger sums are being handled, and the props are obviously very different. First, we don't always understand their function, which immediately makes us more familiar with Zon and pushes us to identify. But everything constantly looks new. Nothing is broken, and when there is a mix of materials, it's for aesthetic purposes. The fact that we see coins in Zon and not in Piltover is also a sign of each city's way of showing power. In the Undercity, having a pile of coins means being powerful. In Piltover, money isn't displayed, because it wouldn't be elegant enough to actually show it. It works the same way for alcohol. It's cheap in Zon, and the glasses, especially those used for spirits, are transparent. In Piltover, wine is expensive, but the glasses are light-tight. Topsiders have a very bourgeois way of displaying their power and wealth through more implicit codes. This is also hypocritical because they put their seal on everything. They wear shiny and golden clothes, so they actually really show their power. It's just less straightforward than in Zon. It's not truly about discretion, it's about exclusivity. This doesn't apply to Mbessa, by the way, who drinks in large and transparent glasses, because conversely to Piltover, Noxious always shows strength. And speaking about strength, The most telling props are probably the weapons. Except for Jinx, who has her pistols, bombs, missiles, and machine gun, in the Undercity, no one has firearms. All weapons are blades, clubs, Molotov cocktails, iron bars, repurposed work tools like vendors' gauntlets, which were originally meant for mining, basically improvised weapons made from salvaged or repurposed objects.
Well, if the enforcers hit tonight, we'll be ready. I think.
Dibs on the bat.
No.
Even the Hextech gauntlets are conceived by Jace and Victor as work tools, but it's Vi who repurposes them as weapons. This partly highlights Jinx's genius, since being used to making her bombs, it's possible she crafted her firearms herself, but above all, it accentuates the disparities between Zon and Piltover. Indeed, in Piltover, any NPC enforcer has a rifle or firearm. We can also note that even there, Piltover practices social distinction, since the Karaman seal is engraved on Caitlyn's bullets. Besides, the Karaman seal is basically almost on everything they own, showing how possession is important to them, but also how their name is almost a label. This disparity in weapons and access to technology accentuates the imbalance in the power dynamic between the two cities and explains why Silco develops Shimmer in the first place. So, Shimmer is a chemical technology shown as dirty and destructive. It corrupts, turns people into monsters, it's addictive, it spreads through space in a parasitic manner, and simply kills those who consume too much of it. Shimmer is organic and fluorescent purple, giving the impression of an ultra-artificial product that we clearly don't want to consume, whereas Hextech is blue, crystalline, and luminous, giving the impression that it's clean or even pure. The Hextech gemstone is the only props to be perfectly smooth and spherical with no asperity. Unlike Shimmer, of which we regularly see puddles, drops, vapors, or even kinds of sticky webs on walls, Hextech doesn't seem to leave residue except for the little blue light that still make it seem clean and even poetic. Shimmer appears dirty and corrupt to us because it soils the space, while at first glance, Hextech leaves no trace after use. Obviously this is an illusion, since the pollution created by Hextech is actually dumped on Zon and leaves organic traces on the tree. These two technologies are used by the powers of each city in order to preserve their respective hegemonies. Silco uses Shimmer to strengthen Zon and increase their fighting capacity, while precipitating them into drug addiction and making them dependent on his own production. Piltover keeps Hextech to itself. The benefits created by the Hex Gate create no arrangement in Zon. Now, you might say Jace and Victor consider sharing Hextech with Zon through certain tools, like precisely the gauntlets. But first, Jace doesn't realize that the Zonites would prefer not to have to go into the mines rather than see their production demands increase.
The mining colonies in the fissures can work faster and without fatigue.
But moreover, even this completely classist approach is hindered by Heimer, who says,
"Putting that kind of power into everyone's hands is dangerous."
Hextech technology is gatekept by Piltover to the point of creating harmless objects that couldn't be turned against it. That's how these two technologies serve power each in their own way, which is not the case in Echo's community. Even if the Firelights don't have major technology that allows them to truly rival, the technologies they develop are once again aligned with their values. For example, the bombs they use to freeze their enemies are non-lethal and seem to use minerals, which is a natural and possibly more ecological approach, and shows their respect for life since they avoid harming their enemies as much as possible. Killing Sevika while she's immobilized would be incredibly easy and would considerably weaken Silco, but instead they attack Shimmer. In the tree community, technology isn't only reserved for an elite or put in service of power, since, for example, anyone can use the hoverboards, and they're also used for entertainment. It might be the only place that develops things for fun, like Heimer's bubble machine. Returning to the duality of Shimmer and Hextech, the second major difference is that Shimmer is consumable while Hextech seems unlimited. Jinx can fire dozens of times with the same Hextech orb with no problem. However, to use Shimmer, you have to consume it. It's therefore a technology that acts within the body, not outside of it, and to be able to fight against Piltover, buff themselves, or even heal, the Zonites, dependent on Shimmer, have no other alternative than to alter their own bodies with ultra-intrusive and dangerous technology at high doses. In short, to resist Piltover, the only alternative they have is to poison themselves, which is ironic because Piltover poisoned them with Grey. That said, Shimmer isn't the only technology that modifies Zonites' bodies, since many are actually cyborgs, and you will see that between Piltover and Zon, the relationship to the body is profoundly different. The parallel between Smeech and Heimerdinger is probably the most telling. Heimer is really cautious when it comes to technology and progress. He uses the past and his great age as arguments of authority, and his cautiousness is always turned towards the future. He doesn't truly care about the present. He's anticipating what lies ahead. Thinking about the future is a privilege that comes from his status, which he doesn't think is threatened. Smeech, despite also being a Yordle, and therefore benefiting from the same life expectancy as Heimer, knows the fragility of his position and the hostility of his environment, which anchors him in a completely different relationship to the present. He's focused on the present moment to the point where he doesn't fear the world changes due to technology and actually practicing them on his own body. So he embraces all the technologies available to him, he's a heavy Shimmer consumer, and his body becomes a true arsenal, allowing him to gain height, fight, and climb walls. Technology is a political, economical, and social stake for Heimer, and he would obviously never apply it to his body, but for Smeech it's survival. Oh, and there's also their fur. Heimer looks like a fluffy fuzzball, and Smeech, well, like...
It's a funny looking rat.
This relationship to the body and to technology is found throughout Piltover and Zaun. In the Undercity, body modifications are extremely frequent. They can be kinds of buffs, like in Smeech's case, but also ways to compensate for injuries, since we see many prosthetics, like Jinx's finger, Finn's jaw, or Rand's hand. These prosthetics can even almost become kinds of armor or exoskeletons, since, for example, this guy's jaw becomes more imposing each time Vi smashes it. And of course, it's also used as weapons. Seeing many more body modifications of this type and cyborgism in Zaun first shows how damaged these characters are, since it usually implies that they've lost a limb or a part of their body that was replaced, and therefore that they're exposed to a much more violent environment. Second, it also shows once again the Zaunites' adaptive capacities and how they manage to turn their after effects into strengths. Even Victor's body extension, his cane, is turned into a stash to smuggle Shimmer. Conversely, in Piltover, everything that seems a bit strange to us is often actually just ornamental, but above all, they have a much easier access to care. Take Caitlyn, for example. Her father is a doctor, so he takes care of her, whereas Jinx closes her wound by stapling her leg, makes her own prosthetic, or at worst, is taken to Singed because he's the only one who can help. Moreover, the class difference of Jace's family is visible even if relatively discreet. His mother, having probably lost 2 fingers in a snowstorm, has 2 prosthetics on her hands, but they're metallic, not golden. It's not jewelry, but it remains pretty and well made. Besides, we can't see any mechanism, so either she can move her fingers, but the mechanism is hidden inside, since we're in Piltover, or she can't bend them. It seems to be the second option. So Zaun's prosthetics seem to function better overall. Piltover, despite being the city of progress, is not good when it comes to some health issues because they don't usually need to treat them. They don't know how to do an articulated prosthesis for Jace's mother because they never have to do it. They don't know how to treat Victor's leg or his sickness because it's due to the Grey. Victor's journey is actually pretty telling too. Piltover's oppression made him sick, then Piltover got him out of Zaun because he was brilliant and couldn't even repair what they did to him in the first place because it's an affliction their people don't get. And that's also a reason why Cassandra's statement about the Zaunites deserving heir is so hypocritical. Piltover doesn't want the Zaunites to die, they want them to work. You can't work if you choke to death. So they let them breathe, but they don't fix what they did. It's not about saving lives, it's about saving labor force. The difference between the characters' bodies is also shown through Zaun's tattoo culture, which can recall gang logic for some characters like Finn, but also punk and underground styles. Piercings and tattoos are also a form of art that reveals a different relationship to self-expression, where Piltover favors a neutral and standardized bodily aesthetic. Zaunites use their skin as a canvas for personal and identity expression. This isn't just a matter of style, but a way of claiming their individuality, while the Upper City tends to dehumanize them. Zaunites having more prosthesis shows that they get hurt more often. I mean, Sevika loses her arm like 3 times. But when it comes to health, Zaunites are also more exposed to addiction. Of course, there is Shimmer, and sometimes they use it because they need care, and nothing else is within their reach. But that said, Shimmer isn't the only addictive substance consumed in Zaun, since many Undercity characters smoke, which isn't the case for anyone in Piltover. Sevika and Silco smoke cigars, Vander his pipe, and we regularly see characters smoking in the background. In the first episodes, right after the children managed to cross the bridge, the series showed that we're not in Piltover anymore by showing a character smoking. In Piltover, very few people smoke. First, there is Lest, who has a somewhat particular role because we know very little about her, and because she's part of the few characters who seem to know Piltover and Zaun equally well, since she talks about Victor to Salo.
I keep hearing about this healer, down in the fissures.
And uses shimmer and smokes it herself. Secondly, some enforcers smoke, which is not surprising because they're not part of Piltover's bourgeoisie. They're probably from a social class even lower than Jace's. The fact that they're the only ones smoking suggests a population who, despite living in Piltover, is not so privileged, but we'll talk about them later. It's the same thing with alcohol. We don't see drunk people in Piltover, well, except for Vi and Loris, who is an enforcer. Topsiders talk about fancy wine and trade it, but alcohol is more present in Zaun. It's consumed in higher quantities, in less fancy ways, and it's cheaper. In fact, drinking in Piltover is part of a social and economic life, whereas in Zaun, it's a coping mechanism. The relationship to the body in Piltover and Zaun is therefore fundamentally different. It's injured, modified, damaged, and hardened in Zaun, aestheticized and sublimated in Piltover. Zaunites' bodies are exploited as labor force in mines or to make war, or even as consumable, since Piltover sometimes calls upon the brothel, as we recall with Mbessa. This boy is from Zaun. We saw him in Babette's brothel, and Mbessa sees him so much as a consumable that she says,
"I'm off to sample the local cuisine."
And we know so little about him that it's his name on Arcane's wiki. Like, come on guys, that's wild. So Piltover rejects the Zaunites, but is okay with objectifying them and sleeping with them, as there is probably no sex worker on their side of the bridge. You might say that Mbessa is not from Piltover, she's a Noxian. First, you're right, and this is a problem I'll treat in my last video about Arcane. Second, I think it's fair to imagine that Mbessa is not the only person from Piltover to do it. Kate went from being absolutely outraged that Vi suggested her to pretend to work in the brothel.
Excuse me? I will not.
To becoming a customer really fast, and I think Salo and Lest are in a grey area. We don't know exactly if she's a healer or a courtesan, but it's very clear that she's of a lower social class than Salo's, and that he doesn't just expect care, but flattery.
I wouldn't have hired you if you weren't versed in the art of indulging your clients' egos.
Though it's not sex per se, Salo still pays for a form of intimacy and emotional performance. And there is also this guy. Yeah, I know, random. But you see him first at the brothel, and then here at the Progress Day party. So his social origins are unclear because people on airships can be from Zaun or from a low Piltover social status, or like Jul and Vern, who are airship pirates, so from neither Piltover nor Zaun. And he's drunk both times, so probably not of a high social class. So I don't know. He might be from Zaun, but he might also be from Piltover, because I don't really see a Zaunite partying on an airship at Progress Day. So there's a possibility that this guy is from Piltover, from a low social status, and goes to the brothel. And he got kicked out, so he might have been disrespectful. Anyway, sex work is always from Zaun, but not its clients. The relationship of the body and technology are therefore radically different in the two blocks, since the first one consumes and exploits the other's labor force in different domains, and the second transforms their own bodies to defend themselves or basically to survive. Ultimately, this shows quite well Piltover's hypocrisy. They maintain a separation between the two cities when it suits them, while profiting from their labor force, sex work, and even shimmer.
I suppose Topside is to blame for all your misfortunes.
Well, yes, Cupcake, that seems pretty clear. There's not only sex workers that cross the bridge. Piltover also takes those we could call the brains, like Victor or Sky from Zaun, but before talking about them, we need to talk about a specific population who operates on both sides, the Enforcers. The class domination is made visible by their presence. The narrative around them is that they protect people.
These brave enforcers sacrificed their lives to defend the values of our great city.
Caitlin believes in this narrative.
For me, knowing how to handle this weapon means being able to protect people.
She wants to solve crime, but aside from her, we don't see enforcers investigating or solving anything. In fact, just like in real life, the police is a repression tool. Gwendola Ricordo is a French sociologist who wrote the book 1312 Reasons to Abolish the Police. J'ai un accent de merde aujourd'hui. She explains.
En fait, la réalité de l'activité policière permet assez peu de résoudre des délits et des crimes. Pourtant, c'est bien ce qu'on nous propose, en tout cas tous les discours qui légitiment l'existence de la police, nous montrent une police qui serait là pour nous protéger, sans jamais d'ailleurs nous dire qui est ce nous, qui est protégé par la police. Et donc, il y a beaucoup eu de réflexions sur ce à quoi sert la police, et on peut définitivement dire que la police ne sert pas à créer davantage de sécurité, elle aurait même tendance à participer à des formes de brutalisation de la société. Par contre, ce qu'elle fait très bien, c'est maintenir l'ordre, l'ordre capitaliste, raciste, patriarcal.
The we truly have to give examples about why the police is problematic? I don't know.
It's a Kentucky police patrol car with a Blue Lives Matter thin blue line Punisher skull on the hood. There's a lot to unpack here.
Just in case, several studies show how structurally racist, sexist, or homophobic the police is in the United States or in France, for example. A UN report from 2023 explains, for instance, that black people are 4.5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. Black people are 3 times more likely to be threatened with the use of force and 11 times more likely to be subjected to police misconduct, insults, prejudice, or sexual misconduct than white people. In 2020, in France, the feminist collective Nous Toutes conducted a survey among people who had filed complaints for sexual violence and stated that among the 3,496 testimonies collected, 66% of respondents reported poor treatment by law enforcement when they wanted to file complaints for sexual violence. In 56% of cases, this poor treatment notably involved refusal to accept a complaint or attempts to discourage the victim to press charges or blaming them.
Sure, just slap a giant skull on the car. Great. Perfect.
Are we the baddie?
In short, globally and structurally, our police oppress the people who are already dominated by society more than they protect them. As we saw in Arcane's world, the only domination is classism, and it's strengthened by the enforcers. That being said, the police oppress physically, while the council, sheltered in the tower, keeps its hands clean by oppressing through administrative procedures, ignorance, and delegation to enforcers. The enforcers' oppression therefore notably involves the bodies of Zonites that they can move, confine, mistreat, or imprison. This can also be a part of why there is so many tattoos in Zon, because people need to reclaim their own bodies. Moreover, the only time we see a character sexually harassing Jinx, it's an enforcer, which is a way of showing how little the notion of respecting others' boundaries or consent is present among them. Furthermore, the police target Zonites, who would be those who need help, but even among them, they attack the most vulnerable. When they enter the children's hideout, only one dares to go towards Klager, who, according to the board, is the second strongest after Vi. None of them goes to Vi, but they're 3 against Milo and Powder. However, enforcers are not from the highest classes of Piltover, even if they're loyal to it. They're from the bottom. As we saw, unlike the other topsiders, they smoke or drink alone outside, and as they don't have clans, they don't have a full name. We have Jace Tallis, Mel Medarda, Caitlin Karaman, but enforcers go by Loris, Grayson, or Marcus, even though 2 of them have been sheriff. The only enforcer who has a full name is
Junior Officer Nolan. Maddie.
But we all know that.
But I'm holding on to what Jay said. We weren't.
Oh!
Well, she's not an enforcer.
Oh, I knew it!
I knew it!
I knew it! I freaking called it!
Besides, even when they die, they're celebrated, but not in the city. Grayson does have a statue, but it's on her grave, while Counselor's statues are in the town. It's the same thing for their funeral. The enforcers killed by Jinx in the explosion are buried several at a time in a military ceremony at the cemetery, and without the people they protected in the first place, since no counselor shows up. Conversely, Cassandra has her own ceremony. She's not buried at the same time as the other counselors who died. It takes place in town, and there are many enforcers. This puts them in a no man's land, not really a part of Piltover, but clearly not a part of Zon. In spite of it, enforcers remain loyal to the power in charge because they hold privilege. First, the comfort of living in Piltover, because even though we only see Marcus's apartment, we can easily imagine that even the basic enforcers' homes remain much more comfortable than those of the lower city. The second privilege is power, the one they exercise over Zon, but also over Stillwater, since before Ambessa and Caitlin took interest in it during Season 2, it's basically the enforcers who impose their authority there. These privileges are sufficient to prevent them from bonding with the Zonites by considering that they experience a common oppression. That said, we can clearly see that the populations are not so distant, notably through the fact that Loris follows Vi. When we meet him, he seems to no longer be part of the police, then joins Vi, then leaves with her and lives in the Undercity for a while. Even if his convictions are not strong enough to oppose Kate's gassing methods in the first place, they are strong enough to make him leave when she establishes her dictatorship with Ambessa. The other enforcer who seems to be aware of this class proximity is Grayson, who tries to act as a buffer between the 2 cities. We see her trying to protect the Zonites to a certain extent, but while maintaining the status quo and kind of a social apartheid.
We had a deal, Vanda. You keep your people off my street, and I stay out of your business.
Grayson therefore maintains peace, but a peace that benefits Piltover, not really the Zonites, since it doesn't allow them to improve their situation. It's difficult to say whether it's because the status quo suits her too, because enforcers would be in the front line if there was a war, or because she has the Undercity's interests at heart.
With all due respect, Counselor, don't you think we've pushed them hard enough?
But in any case, she has little room to operate, since as soon as she suggests a less aggressive approach, they threaten her rank.
Your attitude makes me question if your best is up to the task.
Conversely, Marcus clearly wants to serve Piltover because he's incredibly classist. Thinking he lacks power to do his job properly, he betrays Grayson and makes a deal with Silco, and ends up being oppressed by both Piltover and Zon. Are we gonna cry? No. But this shows pretty much what limits and enforces power. It's only physical, which is a lot, obviously, but when it comes to political forces, they're a step behind because they never organize as a group, except for Caitlin because she accumulates a high police rank and a powerful name, so she doesn't need a group.
I am a decorated officer, leader of House Kiraman. Address me with respect, or keep your mouth shut.
So, on one hand, Kate's abuse shows pretty much that the police can become a problem, but not really how. In our world, cops mostly don't have powerful names, and most of them are from popular classes, but unlike Marcus or Grayson, who are isolated, they're very organized groups. They have powerful unions and can influence politics or put pressure on justice systems or even on governments. But in short, even if they're not from the highest social class, enforcers still remain loyal to Piltover, first because of their classism, but also because even being at Piltover's bottom, they still benefit from Piltover's privileges, and there are a lot. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu considers that an individual's social class doesn't depend solely on their economic capital, but also on cultural, social, and symbolic capitals. The economic capital is the family's material and financial assets. The cultural capital is diplomas, educational resources provided by parents.
Law school?
It's a perfectly respectable place, Daddy.
Access to certain schools.
Harvard Law School? That's right.
And in some cases, some bourgeois codes. The social capital is the family's network and connections, and the symbolic capital is the family's reputation and image.
If I'm gonna be a senator, well, I need to marry a Jackie, not a Marilyn. My family has 5 generations of senators. My brother's in the top 3 at Yale Law, and he just got engaged to a Vanderbilt, for Christ's sake.
In Arcane, all these forms of capital are predominantly held by Piltover at different levels and depending on one's class within Piltover itself. Caitlin's family is probably the most powerful one, since it holds all these forms of capital at the highest level. Even Salo, who is part of the council and therefore holds strong economic and social capital, complains about their symbolic capital.
It's not the girl. It's the name. It bewitches people.
This is partly why the Kiramans or Medardas put their seals everywhere. Mel herself managed to make a place for herself in Piltover thanks to her name.
You should know. Do you really think Mel could have succeeded with...
And therefore her symbolic capital. When she maintains...
One of the many privileges of serving as your counselor is having the occasion now and again to stand behind this podium, to behold so many, joined together not by birth or dictum, but by all that we share.
Well, Mel was literally born into a rich, powerful family. Caitlin's birthright enables her to overthrow the council, and she inherited access to the city's secret.
It's your legacy now, Caitlin.
But remember, you're a Kiraman.
Jay struggles more due to where he was born, and Zonites are born Zonites, with almost no chance to socially ascend. Moreover, even Victor or Sky never really become topsiders and are never truly integrated. By the way, Sky is the only Zonite to actually have a last name.
Good night, Miss Yang.
But here, it's not used by respect. It's a way to put distance between them and to remind her of social hierarchy. So obviously, when characters have last names, their worth is not the same whether they're a topsider or a Zonite. When Kate says,
I am a decorated officer, leader of House Kiraman,
her name is part of her authority.
Caitlin. She's a Kiraman. Just like them, she does whatever she wants. I can't control her.
But when Victor calls Sky Miss Young, it's a way of getting rid of her and reminding her of her social status. The question is, does Mel believe in her own rhetoric about birth? Honestly, I don't think so. Mel is far too smart not to have realized when arriving in Piltover that her name gave her certain advantages. But what Piltover knows or doesn't know, what they do on purpose or not, is precisely one of the show's major problems. On the contrary, Jace, despite having a family name, has weaker social, economic, and symbolic capital since he comes from a family of craftspeople. So he remains subordinate to the Kirimans until his ascension to the council. His possession very clearly shows the social fragility of those who don't have an important name. The Kiriman family can't fall in this system, but they still refuse all contact with Jace when he's kicked out of the academy. Jace is no longer interesting for their network, or might even harm their image rather than improve it, so he's rejected and placed almost at the same level as Zonites since he becomes unacceptable. Friendship or affection don't matter to Kate's parents. This immediately changes when Mel ensures his work is accepted. Suddenly, the Kiriman family becomes friendly again. Obviously, Jace only manages to rise because he's useful to Piltover and particularly to council members, and his social status remains fragile. His new position remains ambivalent until the end, and we can see it because Jace is torn between two floors. He's powerful on the Hexgate Tower at the top, but when he comes back to his social origins on a lower floor in the Forge, he's vulnerable. The fragility of social statuses is also shown by Singe's downfall. He gave up his family name when he was in exile, since it no longer served him in Zon, or could even put him in danger. Heimer is also a good example. Despite a strong symbolic capital as Dean of the Academy, the Council can get rid of him because he has no last name, therefore no family or clan, and no involvement in financial transactions either. Social status is therefore fragile for some and less so for others who do everything to preserve and strengthen it. The Kirimans refuse to speak to Jace to preserve the symbolic capital, and Mel, conversely, uses Jace to strengthen her economic capital. And by the way, the first time we see Mel, she says she's not rich enough. We just came from Zon and we can only think that, yes, she is.
You are the richest person in Piltover.
Yet I remain the poorest Medada.
But Mel still has a weaker symbolic capital than the Kiriman. To be influential, she has to be cunning, whereas Caitlyn can be straightforward. Zonites are obviously disadvantaged on all points, and the few among them who manage to make a place for themselves in Piltover hit a glass ceiling. Even though Victor and Jace developed Hextech together and Jace wants them to be equals, they cannot be. It's Jace who's chosen to represent the man of progress. Yet, he was not alone. He did it with Victor, thanks to a teamwork, notably probably with Sky's help, at the Academy and under Heimerdinger's tutelage. But Piltover chooses to put only one individual in the spotlight, and pretends he did it alone and by his own means. You know, the guy alone in the garage.
CEO entrepreneur, born in 1964, Jeffrey.
Victor doesn't have his place on the posters because Piltover prefers to highlight someone who was already a topsider, not a Zonite, and they use it to strengthen the myth of meritocracy, but only to value their side.
He's a very busy man.
For his part, Victor, before meeting Jace, had little chance of surpassing the status of Heimerdinger's. Victor, before meeting Jace, had very little chance of surpassing the status of Heimer's assistant, and it's neither the Council nor the Academy that recognizes his value. He doesn't emancipate himself either. Jace does it for him because he has more power.
You're the professor's assistant.
No, he's my new partner.
Victor's status seems to improve, but stays the same. Even if the term assistant is replaced by partner, Victor remains Jace's subordinate, and Sky remains Victor's. We know Victor came to Piltover alone and managed to make his place with Heimerdinger, but we don't know how Sky came up, and it's likely through her relationship with Victor, who himself reproduces classist dynamics with her, and in turn imposes a glass ceiling on her. In Zon, the capital stakes are completely different. Vander has social capital that protects him, for example. Silco establishes economic and symbolic capital to stay in power, but before Shimmer, they have nothing that allows them to rival Piltover. The Camp Barons themselves also have a kind of social capital with their gang, and their members wear clothes or tattoos to show signs of belonging. Smeech's men have top hats and are particularly into cyborgism. Margot has her initials on her costume like a seal, and some of her gang members also have it as a tattoo. Cross might be the one we know the least about, and still, his aesthetic is really interesting, as his symbol is the telephone. He's got a phone tattoo on his forehead, something that looks like a headset on his ears, numbers on his fingers, and an old rotary dial on his chest that you can also see on his mansion. His men all have numbers on their foreheads, and Victor Mori, their designer, confirmed that the speakers on their mouths were basically supposed to be body mods, so Cross could use them as literal mouthpieces during his dealings, pulling the strings from the safety of his hideout. So even if it could be a symbolic capital or a demonstration of how Cross has a powerful network, it's also a tool, not just a decoration like the seal we can see in Piltover. The only thing is that Zonites are more willing to stick together. Don't get me wrong, we do see a lot of betrayals in the Undercity, but it's for political stakes, not for their image. Vendors betrays Silco to stop the war. Civica betrays Vendors because she disagrees with his inaction. They don't even want to turn on the kids. They want to fight back, and Civica sticks to it until the end as she doesn't want to snitch on Jinx.
We don't hand over our people.
In fact, Smeech might be the only actual snitch in the Undercity. That's also why Ambessa tortures Jinxers to make them talk. So, while Zonites fight over leadership and tactics, their class solidarity remains stronger than Piltover's, where social exclusion happens quickly over reputation and appearances. Economic disparities are blatant, but there is also a huge gap between the two cities in terms of access to culture. When the children find themselves in Jace's apartment, even though they're in a hurry, Vi's first reflex is to look at the books, and Powder appears particularly smart since she knows what this is.
Whoa. I think this is a real Valdiani.
While even we don't know. This teaches us right away that children have little access to cultural objects, that they like them and want them. Besides scientific tools, books, and beautiful objects, we can see that Jace also has, for example, musical instruments. Culture is not absent from Zon at all, however. The difference is that in Piltover we face a bourgeois or cold culture that is well regarded, considered, complex, and not accessible without a minimum of concentration, knowledge, or expertise. In short, it's an elitist culture. On the contrary, in Zon, art forms are more raw, inspired by more underground and revolutionary cultures. That said, musically, it's in Zon that the show uses the most diegetic music. But it's played on jukeboxes or turntables, vintage devices that give the impression that Zon has few means, while the only diegetic music played in Piltover is live classical music played with an imaginary instrument we don't know. In Zon, the live music, on the contrary, is quite familiar to us, and so are the instruments. In short, Zon has an important artistic culture because it's unifying and helps with revolt, while in Piltover it generally serves as social distinction.
We're not here for the performance.
Moreover, the horns we see in the upper city are used to sound alarms, nothing else. When Jinx comes to support Piltover in the final battle, the horns from the turntables she brought J'adore ce mot, ça doit être mon préféré. When Jinx comes to support Piltover in the final battle, the horns from the turntables she brought parallel Piltover's, but she broadcasts her music, therefore a sound from Zon. Zonites come to help but preserve their identity. This access to culture, material goods, etc. considerably alters living conditions and participates in the oppression of a specific population, the children. I'll delve deeper into it in the next video, but what we can already say here is that children in Piltover are indeed children. They have toys, when they're on the street they're with their parents, while in Zon they hang around, they climb around, search food in the trash, and build weapons that look like toys. Zonite children have to be adults really early, to the point that some of them, like Vi, don't truly realize what a child is.
He knew what he was signing up for.
You almost got me killed.
My little sister could do that when she was 7.
And others don't truly grow up, like Jinx or this guy, and that's a part of why madness is always in Zon.
Genius and madness.
Yes, but Piltover will take the genius and send back their own madness. So Arcane seemingly simplifies a domination system in 2 blocks, but every detail echoes with our world, making Arcane a deeply political piece. Piltover is not an ignorant oppressor. They absolutely know what they're doing and function as a capitalist oligarchy. Their domination has a really strong impact on Zon, as Zonites live it in their flesh through poverty, hunger, and enforces violence. And in their mind, as they don't get to live actual childhoods. But if we talk about childhood, we need to talk more about the characters themselves, and this video is already way too long, so it will be in the next one. If you think I forgot to talk about Metropolis or the alternative universes, don't worry, I didn't. I will on my last Arcane video. Thank you for watching, and if you guys enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next video, share, comment, blah blah blah, you know the drill.